Okay, sorry I can't be with you this week. I've been signed off for the week with back trouble, but I thought I'd use the time to record something which I hope will be of use to you. I'd like you for this session to look at the end of chapter 1, and there's two particular passages that I'll look at. And I'll do two separate recordings, one for each. So this first recording, I'm going to focus on chapter 1 towards the end, and I'm going to concentrate on one particular paragraph, which is sort of George Orwell, his final comment on the Brookers and people like them, sort of his final conclusion before he moves away from this particular house when he basically can't stand it any longer. And then in the second screencast, we'll look at the final one of the final paragraphs in the chapter, which is the first description of the setting and the image of the young, particularly powerful and one of the most famous images in the book. Okay, so let's look at this first passage, Orwell's comment on the Brookers. What I'd like you to do in a moment is pause this recording, and I'd like you to read the passage. And the passage is one paragraph, and it begins, "On the day there was a full chamber pot," to "It is better not to stay there too long." And it's on page 14 of the Penguin edition. And I'd like to focus on these three things. The first thing is the comment Orwell's making on the poverty of people in general, and the effect of industrialisation on the lower classes. Think about the tone of voice that we hear Orwell that comes across here, and finally linking to that what we learn about Orwell, the social commentator, in this chapter, in this paragraph. Remember, it's this particular piece of work that we're doing, that we're moving towards with the commentary. It's as much about you commenting on the person writing as it is what they're writing about. So it's important that all the time we're thinking about both what he says and the way in which he says it. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like to pause this recording now and give yourself, a good 10 minutes to really closely read this paragraph, annotate it with a pencil, make some notes, and then what I'll do is I'll go through the passage in a little bit of detail, picking up on what I perceive to be the important points, the important ideas, and saying something both about what is written and also the way in which it's written. So if you just pause the recording now. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at this paragraph, and I've just broken it into three sections. If we look at this first sentence of the paragraph, "On the day when there was a full chamber pot under the breakfast table, I decided to leave." So in many ways this is the kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, and it's this contrast between the full chamber pot and the breakfast table here, which is really quite disgusting. There's something pretty appalling about the idea of someone's urine and faeces sitting underneath the place where you eat. He's been able to cope with the bed bugs, he's been able to cope with the disgusting table with the crumbs, he's been able to cope with the smell, but when something as deeply unsanitary as a pot full of, well, whatever, underneath the breakfast table, I think that's where he calls it a day. Then he says something interesting here. "The place was beginning to depress me. It was not only the dirt, the smells and the vile food, but the feeling of stagnant, meaningless decay, of having got down into some subterranean place where people go creeping round and round, just like black beetles, in an endless muddle of slovened jobs and mean grievances." And I think this is one of the most dominant ideas that come through from Orwell. It's the meaninglessness. It's the fact that there is no purpose to what is going on here. There's no point. It's not that they're poor, but there's a meaning to their lives. There's no nobility. If we look at some of the more kind of romantic views of poverty, if you read some of the novels of Dickens, for example, and you look at some of the romanticised notions of poverty, of the noble poor man, we don't get that here. There's nothing noble here. There's nothing dignified. It's a meaningless round of nothing, day to day, and the idea of it going subterranean below the earth. And I don't think he's talking about anything hellish here. I don't think he's linking it to hell or Hades. It's just this place that's almost below humanity. That it's sunk to a level which is below what human beings should or can cope with. And then we get this link here, and this word here, creeping, linking to black beetles, that the human beings are almost like insects. There's a link here, I think, into there's a cross-reference here, I think, into Metamorphosis by Kafka. And Franz Kafka, a very famous writer at the turn of the 20th century, looked very much at very similar ideas to Orwell. He looked at the way in which the working class had been somehow dehumanised by the industrial machine. And in Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find that he's been transformed into a giant beetle, giant cockroach. And there's this idea of that he's somehow through his life become dehumanised, turned into something insect-like to go creeping around his life. And I do think there's a link here. Whether Orwell was directly thinking about Metamorphosis when he wrote this, I'm not sure. But there's certainly that sort of beetle-like sense of people being reduced to insect-like status. And there's this awful, I think one of the worst images, the endless muddle. The people are just muddling through their lives. You know, that there's no sense of purpose in their lives at all. They just muddle through one meaningless day after another, and these mean grievances, these grievances that they have, which are really there's this sort of sense of unkindness that it seems to breed. This sense of unkindness. And then he goes on to say the most dreadful thing about people like the Brookers is the way they say the same things over and over again. It gives you the feeling that they're not real people at all, but a kind of ghost forever rehearsing the same futile rigmarole. It really is just the most superb writing. I mean, I think Orwell just absolutely nails it in these two sentences. This sort of meaningless of going round and round and round, and you can see it now. I mean, you know, if you visit, if you know people who are living in poverty, it's the banality of their lives, it's the dullness of their lives, which is the most depressing thing. You know, I mean, I've been off work for 3 and a bit days now, and I can genuinely say, it's the boredom which just gets you, and so. I often, I've had very, very few days off since I've, in the sort of 12, 13 years as a teacher. But I can genuinely say those times when you are off, when you know you should be doing something else, at least you know you can go back to it. But the thought of having it day after day after day, utter meaninglessness, and no sense of hope, which I think is probably the most depressing thing. And I think Orwell just gets it exactly right here. It's the same things over and over again. It's this meaningless banality of life. So Orwell here is not talking about the dirt, the smells, and the vile food. He's not saying that this is, in many ways, he's not saying that this is the worst thing, because I think you can cope with a certain level of dirt, and the smell you could just get used to, and the food you probably get used to as well. But it's the day after day after day of nothingness which I think is the most depressing thing, and it's the thing I think he just gets exactly right here. And the ghost here, the fact that as in poverty, and I think this linking into the idea of the beetle here, that there's something inhuman, there's something less than human about being in extreme poverty. Okay, he goes on in this paragraph. In the end, Mrs. Brooker's self-pitying talk, always the same complaints. There we are, you see, over and over. It's like this. She's stuck in a rut where she can't get out. Always ending with the tremulous whine of, "It does seem hard, don't it now?" Revolted me even more than her habit of wiping her mouth with bits of newspaper. So it's the dull repetition which is worse than actually the the bad habit, what he perceives to be bad habits. But of course, what we get here is we get the middle class commentator coming through. You know, there is middle class judgment here. Habit of wiping her mouth with bits of newspaper. Well, that's you know, it disgusts him, it revolts him, but that's a middle class thing. But it's the repetition which revolts him more. It's the meaningless repetition. And then he goes on here, and he moves away. There's a movement away here from Mrs. Brooker to people like the Brookers. So this is a sort of a broader comment that he's making here. It's no use saying that people like the Brookers are just disgusting and trying to put them out of mind, for they exist in tens and hundreds of thousands. They're not one of the characteristic byproducts. Sorry, they're one of the characteristic byproducts of the modern world. This is quite an interesting way of describing people, I think. It's unusual. As a byproduct, as if they're not human at all, as if they're some result of industrialisation. That people, that these sort of ants or cogs in the wheel are somehow a byproduct of industrialisation. It seems to dehumanise them. Who's the you? It's an interesting one, isn't it? Who's he talking to? You cannot disregard them if you accept the civilization that produced them. But he's appealing to the readers, and of course, these by and large are the middle classes, because it would have been the middle classes by and large which would have read Orwell's writing. Remember that the literacy was dreadful at the time in the 1930s. You know, these miners and their families, a lot of them just couldn't read or write at all, and those that could had pretty poor literacy. They'd have been going down into the mines from being very, very young, so the literacy would be pretty poor. And equally, they wouldn't have been able to afford or probably have the interest in reading something like The Road to Wigan Pier. So the you is very much the middle classes that Orwell is, the audience that Orwell is writing for. You cannot disregard them if you accept the civilization that produced them. But this is part, at least, of what industrialism has done for us. So this process of industrialism, of industrialization, has created a byproduct. And if you accept civilization, if you accept industrialism, you have to accept the byproduct. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the benefits without the cost. Apologies for my spindly writing. You know, in the way that where you produce steel, you'll have a byproduct. You'll have some sort of waste products left over. If you create a society where industrialization is the most important driving factor, you're going to have the byproducts of people like the Brookers, who are living appalling lives in order to provide the coal that drives the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and then this final little bit of the paragraph, and he moves further away now, and he moves back into history, and he looks at the genesis or the development of industrialism. Columbus sailed the Atlantic, the first steam engines tottered into motion, the British squares stood firm under the French guns at Waterloo. There's something a little bit overblown about this. Orwell can lapse, I think, into verbosity, into hyperbole. Hyperbole being kind of exaggerated speech. The one-eyed scoundrels of the 19th century praised God and filled their pockets, and this is where it all led, to labyrinthine slums and dark back kitchens with sickly, ageing people creeping round and round them like black beetles. You've got this kind of binary opposition in play here between the glories of the empire, you know, the glorious empire with its great achievements, its wars, its victories, the praising of God, the filling of pockets, that idea of the middle classes. This is very much linked to the middle classes here. He's really having a dig at the middle classes, because it was the middle classes that made the money in the 19th century through industrialism, and this is where it all led. and you've got this dash here, like labyrinthine slums and dark back kitchens, sickly aging people creeping round and round them like black beetles. It's that repetition there with the similar. So he's setting up this binary opposition here between the glory of the post-Enlightenment revolution, linking into the byproduct of the appalling life that the people lead in order to provide the coal, so that the coal that literally drives the engine of the Industrial Revolution. It's a kind of duty to see and smell such places now and again. Whose duty is it? Well, it's the duty of the middle classes. And I think this is where this is very powerful. You know, for all his hyperbole, for all his verbosity, I think this is a very, very powerful paragraph, which is why it's one of those key paragraphs in the book, because he's really contrasting the progress with the reality, and that it's a duty for us to know. In the same way, you know, if we go and we buy a pair of Nike trainers, let's not kid ourselves that we're not, you know, that our cheap trainers that we're buying are, and the byproduct of those cheap trainers is a sweatshop somewhere in India, you know, or the Philippines. We can't. It's a duty for us to know that the lives that we lead now, in the way that the lives of the people in the 1930s who had money led, the lives that we lead now are that there is a byproduct, and the byproduct is that there are people in the world who are living in appalling conditions in order to provide us with the luxuries. You know, I think this is a very relevant text even now. I don't think we can kid ourselves that somehow we're living in some utopia. We're not. You know, what Orwell talks about now is still happening today, and I do think we do have a duty to know about these things. And I think this is why this is an important and a relevant text now as it was 70 or 80 years ago. And he says this kind of duty to see them, especially smell them, lest you should forget that they exist, though perhaps it is better not to stay there too long. Why? Probably because you become like them, that you would become as disheartened, as depressed, and actually you would not then be able to take action, because time and again Orwell talks about the deadening effect of poverty, that poverty is something which creates a laziness which cannot easily be broken out of. And so for people like Orwell to go and spend time there was important, but actually it was equally as important to leave so that he could write about it, so that he could get the energy, because it's fairly obvious when he was there he felt the deadening effects of the poverty on him. Okay, we're going to stop this recording, and then what I'll do is I'll start another one, and we'll look at the final paragraph, or one of the final paragraphs in the book, which takes this idea at the end of this paragraph and develops it further.